The grand halls of the royal palace shimmered under the golden glow of the chandeliers, filled with noblemen and ladies adorned in their finest attire. The sound of music and laughter echoed through the vast ballroom, but amidst all the splendor, Prince Adrian felt suffocated. Tonight was meant to be a celebration, a gathering of kings and queens, yet to him, it was just another reminder of the life he was trapped in, a life of duty, rules, and expectations. As he stood near the towering windows overlooking the moonlit gardens, his mind wandered. He had always known that love, for someone of his status, was nothing more than a political strategy. His future had been planned long before he was even born. But fate had its own plans, and his heart had already been stolen by a girl no one knew, a girl who had no title, no family name, and no place in his world. He had met her by accident, or at least that's what he told himself. One evening, desperate for an escape, he had sneaked out of the palace, disguising himself as an ordinary traveler. He wandered the city streets, breathing in the scent of fresh bread and listening to the cheerful chatter of merchants. That's when he saw her, Elena. She wasn't like the noble women he knew. She was simple, yet her presence was impossible to ignore. She had the kind of warmth that made even the coldest night feel like spring, the kind of smile that made the world seem a little less cruel. Elena worked at a small bookstore, her hands always covered in ink, her eyes always lost in stories of love and adventure. She had no idea who he really was, and for once, Adrian didn't want to be a prince. He just wanted to be a boy who could love freely, without consequences. And so, he returned to her shop day after day, pretending to be nothing more than an ordinary customer, just to hear her talk, just to see her smile. But secrets have a way of unraveling, and in a kingdom where love was a privilege reserved for the powerful, their fragile happiness was built on borrowed time. Because the moment Elena learned the truth about who he really was, everything would change. And when the palace discovered his forbidden love, the cost of his heart's desire would be far greater than either of them could ever imagine. Adrian knew he was playing a dangerous game, but he couldn't stop himself. Every moment with Elena felt like a stolen piece of freedom, a life that wasn't his to live. He memorized the way she laughed, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was deep in thought. She spoke of dreams and possibilities, of places beyond the kingdom's borders, unaware that the boy listening so intently was bound to a throne he never asked for. But the walls of the palace were watchful, and secrets were never truly safe. Whispers had already begun to spread. Rumors of the prince's frequent visits to the marketplace, of a girl with no name who had unknowingly captured his heart. His father, King Edric, was a man of order and power, a ruler who saw love as nothing more than a weakness. The court was already filled with noble daughters, each one hoping to become the future queen. If the king ever learned of Elena, there would be no mercy. Elena, oblivious to the storm brewing around her, had only just begun to sense that something about Adrian wasn't quite what it seemed. He spoke too eloquently for a common traveler, carried himself with a quiet grace that didn't belong to the streets. She noticed the way strangers sometimes stole quick glances at him, as if they recognized something she did not. Yet, she never asked, perhaps because she didn't want to break the fragile world they had created. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, Adrian arrived at the bookstore later than usual. There was something different in his eyes, a shadow of worry he couldn't quite hide. Elena watched him, sensing the weight of something unspoken between them. "You're troubled," she said gently, setting aside the book she had been reading. Adrian hesitated. He wanted to tell her everything, to take her hands in his and confess who he was, what they were risking. But fear held him back. If she knew the truth, would she still look at him the same way? Would she still smile at him as if he were just a boy and not a prince trapped in a golden cage? Before he could find the right words, the door to the bookstore swung open and a stranger stepped inside. A man cloaked in dark robes, his sharp eyes scanning the room before settling on Adrian. The moment was over. The walls of reality were closing in, and the world they had built between them was about to shatter. Elena sensed the shift in the air the moment the stranger entered. His presence felt out of place, too heavy, too deliberate. He wasn't a customer, and he wasn't here for books. Adrian stiffened beside her, his body tensing as if preparing for something unseen. The man's gaze lingered on Adrian, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow, knowing smirk, he spoke. "Your Highness, you've been difficult to find." Elena's breath caught. The words rang through the small shop like a distant thunder, shaking the foundation of everything she thought she knew. She turned to Adrian, searching his face for denial, for any sign that this was some mistake. But he didn't say a word. His silence was the only answer she needed. The man stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Your father is waiting. You know what happens when you defy the king." Adrian clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had been careful, or so he thought, but the palace had eyes everywhere, and now the fragile world he had built with Elena was collapsing. He looked at her, desperation in his eyes. "Elena, I—" She took a step back, her heart pounding. The boy she thought she knew wasn't just a traveler or a dreamer. He was a prince who had lied. "You should leave," the man continued, his voice colder now, "before more come looking for you. And trust me, next time, it won't just be me." Adrian knew what that meant. If he didn't return willingly, the king would send soldiers. And if they found Elena, he didn't even want to think about it. He turned to her, his voice urgent. "Elena, please, just listen to me." But she shook her head. "You lied to me," she whispered, hurt flashing across her face. "Why?" The pain in her voice cut deeper than he expected. He had always feared this moment, but standing here now, facing the betrayal in her eyes, was worse than anything he had imagined. The stranger grabbed Adrian's arm. "We're leaving. Now." Elena watched as Adrian hesitated, his body torn between duty and love. But in the end, there was no choice. As the door closed behind them, she was left standing in the dim light of the shop, staring at the empty space where he had been. And for the first time, she realized, whatever this had been, whatever it could have been, it was over. Or at least, that's what she tried to tell herself. Elena didn't sleep that night. The bookstore felt colder, emptier, as if the air itself had been stripped of the warmth Adrian had brought with him. She replayed the moment over and over, the stranger's words, Adrian's silence, the way he had been forced to leave without a fight. He hadn't even tried to explain, or maybe he knew there was no way to. But something inside her refused to accept that this was the end. The look in Adrian's eyes before he was taken, it wasn't regret, it wasn't surrender. It was something else, something unfinished. Days passed, and the city grew restless with rumors. Whispers of the prince's defiance spread through the streets. The palace had tightened its grip, guards patrolling more frequently, watching, listening. Some said the king was furious. Others claimed Adrian had been locked away, punished for his rebellion. No one knew for sure, but Elena couldn't ignore the feeling that this wasn't over. Then, one evening, as she was closing the shop, a figure stepped out from the shadows. Her heart leapt to her throat, but before she could scream, a familiar voice hushed her. "It's me." Adrian. He looked different, his clothes no longer royal, his face hardened. his eyes filled with something she hadn't seen before. He was breathless, desperate, but most of all, determined. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I had to see you," he said, stepping closer. "I had to explain." Elena didn't move. She wanted to run, to be angry, to demand why he had lied. But now, standing before him, all she felt was fear. Fear for him, for whatever reckless decision had brought him back. "I can't stay," he admitted. "But I need you to know, I never meant to lie. I wanted to tell you so many times, but I was afraid of losing you." He swallowed hard, lowering his voice. "And now, I have no choice but to leave for good." Elena's chest tightened. "What do you mean?" Adrian looked around, making sure they were alone. "My father is planning something. He won't just keep me locked away. He'll make sure I can never come back. I have to escape before it's too late." A lump formed in Elena's throat. "Where will you go?" Adrian hesitated. "That depends," he said softly, holding her gaze. "On whether you'll come with me." Elena's breath caught at Adrian's words. The weight of his offer pressed against her chest, heavy and impossible. Leave? With him? She had dreamed of adventure, of a life beyond the walls of this city, but she had never imagined it would come to this. Not like this. "You want me to run away with you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own heartbeat. Adrian nodded, urgency burning in his eyes. "It's the only way. If I stay, my father will ensure I never leave the palace again. He'll force me into a life I don't want, a marriage, a crown, a future that isn't mine to choose. But if I leave now, I can be free. We can be free." Elena wanted to believe him. She wanted to reach for his hand and say yes, to throw caution to the wind and escape into the night. But the world wasn't a story in one of her books. It was cruel and unforgiving, and she knew the king would never let his son simply disappear. "Do you really think he'll just let you go?" she asked, forcing herself to say what he didn't want to hear. "He's the king, Adrian. He has power, soldiers, influence. He'll come after you." A muscle tensed in Adrian's jaw. "I know," he admitted. "That's why I need your help." Elena frowned. "My help?" Adrian hesitated for only a moment before speaking. "There's someone who can get us out of the kingdom without being seen. A smuggler. He's helped others escape before, but he won't trust me alone. He'll only do it if I bring someone from the outside, someone without royal ties." Elena stared at him, stunned. "You need me as a bargaining chip?" His eyes widened in alarm. "No, Elena, that's not what I mean. I want you to come with me, but I won't force you. If you say no, I'll find another way." He took a breath, lowering his voice. "But if you come, we'll have a real chance." A storm of emotions swirled inside her. She had spent her whole life in this city, safe in the quiet of her bookstore, dreaming of faraway places, but never daring to chase them. Now, adventure stood before her, not in the form of a story, but as a flesh and blood reality. And it came with danger. Before she could answer, a sharp knock echoed against the wooden door. They both froze. Adrian moved first, grabbing Elena's wrist and pulling her behind a shelf. They barely had time to hide before the door creaked open and a group of men stepped inside. Elena's stomach dropped. These weren't customers. These were palace guards. One of them, a man with a jagged scar along his cheek, stepped forward and scanned the room. Elena's pulse pounded as the guards moved deeper into the shop, overturning bookshelves and scanning every shadow. Adrian's grip on her wrist tightened, his breath shallow. There was no way out, only a single back door, and even that was risky. If they hesitated even a second too long, they would be caught. The moment the guards turned their backs, Adrian whispered, "Run." They burst from their hiding spot, racing toward the back door. The sudden movement caught the guards' attention, and shouts erupted behind them. "There! Stop them!" Elena's hands trembled as she fumbled with the lock. The heavy boots of the guards pounded closer. Just as one of them lunged, Adrian shoved his shoulder into a bookshelf, sending it crashing to the floor, blocking their path. It gave them only a moment, but a moment was enough. The door burst open, and they sprinted into the darkened alley. The city was alive with lanterns and voices, but Adrian pulled Elena through the maze of narrow streets, his grip firm, his pace unrelenting. They had no time to stop, no time to think. Somewhere behind them, the king's men were searching, growing closer. Finally, they reached the river's edge, where a lone figure waited, a man draped in a tattered cloak, standing beside a small boat. "You're late," he muttered. Adrian helped Elena into the boat before turning to the man. "Can you get us across?" The smuggler gave a slow nod and began untying the ropes. But just as Adrian stepped in, a voice rang out behind them. "Adrian, stop!" They turned to see a group of soldiers standing on the dock. But at the front of them wasn't just any soldier. It was King Edric himself. His cloak billowed in the wind, his face unreadable. "You think you can just run?" The king's voice was calm, almost amused. "You are my son. You belong to this kingdom." Adrian clenched his fists. "Not anymore." The king sighed, then looked at Elena. "And what about her?" His eyes held something colder now. "Do you think she'll ever be safe no matter where you go?" Elena felt a chill run through her. He wasn't just threatening Adrian. He was promising that as long as she was with him, they would never stop hunting her. Adrian's jaw tightened. He turned to Elena, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite understand. Then, before she could react, he grabbed her shoulders and whispered, "Lev," and then he shoved her into the boat. The smuggler reacted instantly, pushing them off just as Adrian turned back to face his father. Elena screamed his name, but it was too late. The last thing she saw was Adrian standing tall, surrendering himself as the boat drifted into the darkness. "Search the place," he ordered. "The king wants his son back, and if the girl knows something, bring her too." Elena's heart pounded as she clutched Adrian's arm. He met her gaze, his expression filled with silent urgency. They had only seconds to decide, run or be caught. Elena's hands trembled as the boat drifted farther away. Her eyes locked on Adrian until the darkness swallowed him. The wind carried the distant sound of the king's voice, but she could no longer make out the words. All she knew was that Adrian was gone, and there was nothing she could do to change that. The smuggler rode in silence, his face unreadable. Elena's heart ached, torn between grief and anger. Adrian had made the choice for her, forcing her to escape while he sacrificed himself. She wanted to scream, to turn back, to fight for him. But deep down, she knew if she had stayed, neither of them would have made it out alive. The city lights faded behind them, and the river carried them toward the unknown. Elena didn't know where she was going, only that she had no choice but to keep moving forward. She pressed a hand against her chest, trying to steady her breathing, trying to hold on to the last thing Adrian had told her. Live. Days passed, and the smuggler eventually left her in a quiet village far from the kingdom. It was nothing like the city she had known, no grand palaces, no towering bookshelves, but for the first time in her life, she was truly free, free to make her own choices, free to decide who she wanted to be. But freedom came with pain. Every night, she wondered what had happened to Adrian. Had the king punished him, locked him away, or was he still out there, waiting for the right moment to break free? She had no answers, only hope. One evening, as she sat by the riverbank, a stranger approached, a messenger carrying a single letter. Elena's hands shook as she opened it. The ink was smudged, the words hurried, but the moment she saw the familiar handwriting, her heart nearly stopped. I promised you a choice. Now I'm making one of my own. I will return when the time is right. Until then, live. Tears welled in Elena's eyes. It wasn't goodbye. It was a promise. As she folded the letter close to her heart, she realized something. This wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning.